Games with Jeff. Folks, if you know anything about me by now, you know that I'm a pretty chill guy. So it should come as no surprise that I'm a big fan of the Frost Decay. Now, I've always had a strong fondness for Death Knights ever since their introduction in Wrath, and while they've become easier and far less complex over the years, there's still something about the class that resonates with me. I mean, how can you make an undead hero forced to serve the Lich King who escapes from his control and then defeats the Burning Legion even cooler? Well, that's easy. Just cover it nice and there you go. That's like an 11 on the badass meter for sure. Nothing else can compare. It's true that Frost was underrepresented in Tomb of Sargeras, but their strong AoE damage and a few buffs to their abilities help make them the go-to spec for Death Knight DPS in Antorus. The Breath of Sindragosa build was especially strong in fights like Kingroth, where strong burst damage helped to quickly clear away the priority adds that spawned throughout the fight. The unique utility of Death Grip helped ensure that at least one DK was practically required on Heroic or higher Agromar. All of this meant that Frost DK was one of the most welcomed melee DPS in raid groups. But sometimes the jump to a new expansion can leave certain specs behind. Put on your helmets and lock your doors, folks, because we're going to take a look at Frost DK as it currently plays on the Battle for Azeroth Beta. And like a number of specs we've covered so far in this series, Frost DK players from Legion will notice far more similarities than differences. The rotation is still built around generating and using procs quickly, thereby assuring that the player won't overwrite and waste any additional procs. In an earlier beta build, Pillar of Frost was taken away from the spec, but not to worry, the developers listened to reason and returned the ability to us. Of course, the artifact weapon is now gone, and with it our artifact ability and quite a few passives. But don't worry too much, because Sindragosa's Fury, or at least a talent that partially replaces it, has been added to the tree. I will miss the Crystalline Sword's passive, which made neat-looking ice swords spawn and mimic your abilities. It was one of the visual aspects that I really enjoyed about the spec. The basic gameplay rotation of the spec revolves around using your runes, which passively regenerate, to spend on Obliterate, while using your runic power on Frost Strike. Obliterate has a chance to generate a Rime proc, which makes Howling Blast do extra damage and cost no runes, while your auto attacks have a chance to generate a Killing Machine proc, which makes your next Obliterate critically strike. It's important to use these procs as soon as they are available, while also making sure that both runes and runic power are being spent quickly enough that they don't cap, and thus waste resources. If you want to be super fancy, use Remorseless Winter on cooldown too. Try to use Empower Rune Weapon when you're in danger of running out of resources, and burst as much damage as possible for Pillar of Frost. The basic rotation is thus fairly straightforward. As long as you're using your procs and you don't cap resources, you'll be doing a pretty good job. Taking different talents augments the spec's playstyle, but honestly not by much. While there are a few talent changes from Legion, nevertheless the spec still feels very similar. The 56 tier has 3 passives. The first, Inexorable Assault, causes Obliterate to do extra damage each time it consumes a stack, which regenerates every 8 seconds. The second, Icy Talons, makes Frost Strike increase melee attack speed for 6 seconds, stacking up to 3 times. The final passive is called Cold Heart and operates like the Legion Legendary. Every 35 or 40 seconds, the player uses Change of Ice to do a bit of burst damage. I feel like this final talent is the most interesting of the 3. Inexorable Assault, for instance, requires no attention from the player, while Icy Talons forces the player to use Frost Strike every 6 seconds, which they will be doing pretty much already anyway. Hopefully, Cold Heart will be tuned well enough that it's a viable selection. The 57 tier has 2 passives and 1 ability. All 3 provide extra runes and runic power. The first, Runic Attenuation, is completely passive and causes your auto attacks to generate runic power. The second, Murderous Efficiency, makes it so that using your Killing Machine procs has a chance to refund 1 rune. And the third, Horn of Winter, grants 2 runes and 25 runic power every 45 seconds. Personally, I've never been a fan of these talent abilities that grant resources. It always feels slow pushing a button just to get runes and runic power. The other 2 passives require almost nothing from the player, so 99% of raiders will just pick whichever one sims highest and forget about it. The 58 tier has a number of utility buffs. Death's Reach, which increases the range of Death Grip and makes killing an enemy reset its cooldown. Asphyxiate, which stuns targets for 4 seconds on a 45-second cooldown. And Blinding Sleet, which disorients in a cone in front of a player on a 1-minute cooldown. Frost Decays have been annoyed at losing out on Asphyxiate, and they'll be very happy to have it back. The Death's Reach talent is a handy bit of utility as well. The 60 tier again has 2 passives and 1 active ability. Avalanche causes your Rime procs to make icicles fall on nearby enemies. Frozen Pulse makes your auto attacks do AoE damage when you have less than 3 full runes, And the last one, Frost Scythe, is the favored AoE selection from Legion. Frozen Pulse sounds a bit interesting and makes for a slightly more complicated build, but most Frost DKs are going to be spinning the runes fast enough not to have to worry too much about maintaining the buff. Frost Scythe will likely be the preferred talent in most AoE situations. The 75 row has movement, abilities, and buffs. The first talent, Permafrost, makes your auto attacks also shield you for a portion of damage. Less than the amount it did in Legion, but auto attack damage was also increased a good amount, so perhaps it will even out. Wraithwalk is the movement ability DKs had in Legion. Nobody's favorite, but it does increase movement speed by 70% for 4 seconds. With the return of Death's Advance, DKs are finally a good deal less restricted in their movement. Death Pact is an interesting talent that heals the player for 50% of their maximum health, but absorbs 30% of incoming healing over 15 seconds. The 90 row has Gathering Storm, Glacial Advance, and Frostworm's Fury. Gathering Storm is a passive that makes each rune spent increase the damage and duration of Remorseless Winter. This has often been a strong passive, and likely will be again. Glacial Advance is an ability that radiates spikes forward, damaging enemies. Frostworm's Fury is a great talent for folks who are missing their awesome Ice Dragon, but its damage has been greatly decreased and its cooldown decreased to 3 minutes as well. Now, the lengthy but bursty cooldowns that both DK specs had, they were, in my opinion, one of the things that made them kinda cool and unique from other specs. It's a shame that it's been changed and competing on a tier with Gathering Storm. Frostworm's Fury may not even end up being used very often. The 100 tier has Ice Cap, Obliteration, and Breath of Sindragosa. Obliteration has been changed into a passive. It's now only on during Pillar of Frost, which, to be fair, was the only time that it was used before anyway. Ice Cap is another passive that makes critical strikes reduce the cooldown of Pillar of Frost. Breath of Sindragosa is similar to how it was in Legion. It's a long breath attack that continues to do damage until you run out of runic power. It's likely that it'll end up being strong, just like it was during Nighthold and early Legion progression. I feel like it's one of the few talents that actually dramatically affects the feel and rotation of the spec, so I hope that after final tuning it ends up being, at the very least, a viable option on the tier. Overall, I feel like Frost is a good spec in BFA, as long as you don't mind playing something that's admittedly a bit simple. It suffers from the same problem of many specs going into BFA, and that is the fact that it simply feels like a kinda lesser version of its Legion counterpart. What was already a pretty straightforward spec in Legion has been made even more simple with the removal of the artifact ability. If a passive ends up being the better option on the 90 tier, then it's effectively one less button Frost DKs need to press. Making Obliteration passive instead of active only adds to the simplicity of the spec. So many of the talents are passives which require very little thought from the player, that, for the most part, which one ends up being the strongest is largely irrelevant and unnoticeable to the player. This is alleviated somewhat by taking Breath of Sindragosa, but it's a bit of a disappointment that there are only 1 or 2 options out of the whole talent tree that fundamentally alter the playstyle of the spec. Regardless, I think Frost is a good choice for someone who wants a fast-paced melee spec where reacting to procs is the order of the day. I quite enjoyed Frost in Legion, and I imagine I will like it in BFA as well, though maybe not by quite as much. Thanks for watching, folks. Please do like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. It's a great help for the channel and I'd really appreciate it. If you want to go above and beyond the Call of Duty, then consider donating $1 on my Patreon, which is linked in the description below. I make these videos on ancient hardware, and a few extra dollars goes a long way to help pay for upgrades. Cheers, folks, and I'll see you soon.